Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Today is the 3rd of May, 1984, and I'm in Edmonton. Today I'm interviewing Mrs. Clara Mintz, who's had long experience in social work in Alberta. Mrs. Mintz, in order to start, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born, and a little bit about your background.
Well, I was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and shortly thereafter, my family moved to a little village, Bethune, Saskatchewan, where I received my elementary and high school education. There were 250 people in the population, and my father operated a general store. And I went to the typical small town school where all the grades were in one room. And well, it was rather a cheerless existence as far as amenities were concerned. I mean, no movies, no electricity, no running water. The things that children today take for granted, we didn't have. But we had other things. We had to be resourceful in our activities, the things that we had to do. We did a lot of reading. Radio came out at that time, which was a great excitement to all of us, and it sort of opened a world to us. But then I went on to the University of Saskatchewan, where I received my BA.
Mm-hmm. You were in university during the Depression, weren't you?
Yes. I graduated in 1939.
Mm-hmm.
And in those days, it wasn't fashionable to have a pair of stockings without a rung in them. We had to live very, very carefully. And it was a great sacrifice to my father to have to put me through. My mother had been a semi-invalid for many, many years, and she passed away in 1936. And I had to nurse her the last 3 years of her life. So there was a break in my education while I did that.
Mm-hmm.
Some of my university I took by correspondence. Then I took a year off to be home with my father, and I helped him in the store. And of course, you do make a lot of contact with people. I think I started to be a people person at that time. I decided to take social work. And it was rather interesting. My decision had nothing to do with what social work meant. All I knew was that it was helping people. And I had a sight handicap. And I wanted to take law or some education relating to looking after people. And social work seemed to be the thing that would use less eyesight than any of the other professions.
Mm-hmm.
So off the country girl went to Toronto, to the School of Social Work there. And when I selected Toronto, it was considered the best school in Canada. At that time, there were only 2 schools. One was in Montreal, and the other Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
I had preferred to go to the United States. I had dreams of going to Johns Hopkins or one of the large universities, but there wasn't any money. And therefore, with a lot of struggle, I went to Toronto. At that time, Miss Agnes McGregor was the director of the school. And there were people on the faculty like Barbara Finlayson, Stuart Jaffrey. Some truly wonderful, dedicated people. There were only 25 students graduated a year at that time. And strangely enough, the class I was in, we all seemed to stay in social work for years and years and years. Some of them are living around Edmonton now, like Stuart Bishop, George McClellan, Ray Godfrey was on the faculty at the school, Dorothy Cass, who's been with the Children's Aid for many years. And so I could name you a number of people who excelled. Miriam Waddington, who excelled as an author, but didn't remain on in social work. Mm-hmm. And so there were an interesting group of people. And we learned two things. We didn't learn to be mental health therapists. We learned to be caseworkers. And we had a commitment and a dedication and a caring, because certainly there was no remuneration worthwhile. My first position was with the Baron de Hirsch Institute in Montreal, and I earned a munificent sum of $85 a month net. My gross salary was $100, and we all had to buy a war bond, and it was deducted. But it was an exciting time. I guess maybe I had the Western pioneer spirit or something, but Montreal was a fascinating city. I was given a district which was the poorest in the Jewish agency. Mm-hmm. And we had a variety of clients. I was shocked to find there was such a thing as a Jewish prostitute. Mm-hmm. We had those. I was shocked to find that we had a gangster who belonged to a mob, and I had him for a client. And the families were dreadfully poor, and the funds for welfare were given by the Quebec Public Charities, the provincial government. It was called QPCA. And at that time they had inspectors who went around checking on the social workers. And so it was sort of like almost like a Gestapo. They would phone the director of the agency and say, oh, Mrs. So-and-so is receiving funding from your agency, and she just bought a bed. Well, the poor woman had no other furniture in her place but a second-hand bed. But this is the type of thing that went on at that time.
You were saying that the QPCA, Quebec Public Charities Act, gave funds, welfare funds or relief funds, whichever they were called at the time.
They would channel them through the agency. We would put the family on budget. I used to call it semi-starvation, not starvation. It was very traumatic for me to have to cut a budget for a family. But if a child went to work, he or she immediately had to give half their salaries to the budget. And so you'd have to go and cut the budget. And here this youngster would then have no incentive to go out and keep working.
Mm-hmm. Did the agency check on eligibility?
Oh yes, there was the means test, and we tried to be flexible. It would cost the agency extra funds. For example, we used to give additional funds for Jewish high holy days such as Passover, which was not recognized by QPCA. We had to be very resourceful in those days in order to help families have an opportunity for rehabilitation. And so you would see second and third generations of people who had been on welfare. You just couldn't break that circle.
At the time you were with the Baron de Hirsch Institute, 1942 and 43, was it?
Mm-hmm.
That was the time of war, and in many parts of the country there was a real economic boom, but there were still people who couldn't benefit from that.
These were the people who you would call the chronics. They couldn't work because of various physical ailments. There was a high rate of heart disease, hypertension. Many of these people had their roots in Europe. They were Yiddish speaking. There were the old, which would go on forever, receiving assistance.
What was it like for you as a girl from the prairies and from the West coming to a tremendous urban area like Montreal?
Well, it was a little scary at first, but there was a terrific staff at that time. Miss Ethel Austry was the director, and Ruth Schaefer Getz was the supervisor, and we just had a marvelous staff of dedicated and committed people working there. And so that personally and socially, I found it very satisfying. And I also found the work very exciting and challenging. And I had a lot of energy, boundless energy. And I threw myself into the work, and I loved every moment of it. Somehow money didn't matter. It was more important helping people. So that it's a far cry from the type of professionalism that we see today and the sort of work we did back in the 40s.
What difference do you see from then to now?
Well, I've always described it as gut social work, where you really got into it and people didn't have time to work on psyches when the client was working on a ton of coal. You had to be realistic and really down to earth and understanding. And above all, you had to have a sense of humor. You couldn't have survived without it.
You were with the Baron de Hirsch Institute for a while and then moved along. Vancouver and then Regina.
Yes, it was rather interesting. I got married, and to Dr. David Mintz, who's a dentist, and he was a captain in the dental corps at the time. And so as he got moved, I moved with him. And wherever I went, there was always a job waiting for me. At first, we were married out in Victoria, so, and he was transferred to Vancouver. So I worked sporadically with the Vancouver Family Agency. Because of the fact that I'd be moved around, my work was to interview wives of soldiers who were overseas and receiving the dependence allowance. And some of the girls weren't behaving too well. And so it was sort of a cross-check and some real referrals where we had to do these, what I'd call an investigation, and make a report for the government, and how these people were managing and if they were having problems.
The dependence allowance under the Dependence Board of Trustees was a fund and an allowance paid to the wives of servicemen. Was there eligibility for that dependent on their behavior?
No. You got it anyway. I mean, your husband was overseas or in the Army, and it was the sum of $90 a month. So that this you got outright from the government, and then your husband assigned so much of his pay to you.
But there was also a social service so that capacity that accompanied the dependence allowance. I'm trying to see the relationship between getting the money and being good.
Well, I don't like to think of it as being good, but there were people with problems, real problems of separation from husbands, loneliness. Some were caring for children, some had babies while the husbands were overseas. The father hadn't seen the child yet. And so these girls had a lot of problems. Some of them had to be followed up, or else you could explain what was happening to this individual, which on the surface, some of them would have landladies who would report them to the government. A lot of hearsay things, but people wouldn't understand what was really happening to this person while the husband was away.
And would you be in correspondence then with the husband as these things were working themselves through?
Well, my particular position was not to carry on, but to do an assessment, and which I would turn into the agency. And sometimes I would recommend that there be follow-up counseling and so on to help this woman through a difficult period. And it was quite a task for family agencies. During the war, they did quite a bit of this. I did quite a bit of it in Regina too, but my husband was stationed away out in Tofino, which is at the, I guess it was the tip of Vancouver Island, and women couldn't go there. So I went to Regina where I had family, and I lived with my in-laws for 6 months. And during that time I worked at the Regina Welfare Bureau and did a variety of things that any family agency does. Casework, some welfare assistance, following up on these what we call DVA cases, and working with old people, and you name it, children, delinquents. The family agency at that time was the cornerstone of all services relating to the family.
And that was true in most of the communities?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. You moved on then to Winnipeg. Was that a result of your husband's transfer too?
He went overseas. And it happened that my closest friend, Miss Thelma Tesler, was the director of the agency. She had worked in Montreal with me. And so she invited me to come and join her. She needed an assistant. And that was an agency that was in the pioneer stages. It was known then as the United Hebrew Social Services. It is now known as the family and child service in Winnipeg. And we did a really pioneered job. In addition to giving all the variety of services that a family agency gives, we were instrumental in having the Jewish orphanage closed. It was an old institution, but they had about a half a dozen children running around in this huge building, and so we reunited some of these children with families, or else we placed them in foster homes, and so eventually they closed the institution. And so that's when we had the changeover into foster home care rather than institutional care.
Was it difficult to find foster homes in those days?
Yes, I used a lot of shoe leather looking for good foster homes. And then on top of it, we started to get the refugees from Europe, Jewish people who had been in the what they called the DP camps after being let out of the concentration camps. The survivors, the first groups that came in were the tailors, people in the clothing trades, mainly, because Winnipeg was a center for the clothing industry in Western Canada. We also had a very interesting time, and unfortunately I missed it, but we got the Canadian Jewish Congress orphans. There were 1,000 children allowed into Canada. These children had nothing but a name tag on them. They were picked up all over Europe, had no parents, they were all killed in the camps. And some of these children had been eating out of garbage tins. And they were spread across Canada. Some of them are in Edmonton, who are very prominent businessmen today. We just have thousands, well, I should say hundreds of success cases. I only know of one failure. I have this young man, and he had been so traumatized by the experience he had as a child that there was no way of reaching him. And so he's a wanderer.
Regarding the influx of displaced persons, refugees, how, in those days, at that time, how did one approach the problems that they were having? Were you using psychotherapy and counseling and that sort of approach, or were you using the casework approach? What did the agency think was going to help those people at that time?
Well, number one, basics. Casework, yes. But the basic thing when these people stepped off the train was they had to have shelter, they had to have food, clothing, and a job. Now, many of these people, once they got the basics, managed very well until their children became Canadianized. The children became quickly Canadianized, whereas the parents were slower, and their expectations were different than Canadian parents. And so conflicts arose. And so you got those in the adolescent stages and the pre-adolescent. Now, many of these people, I mean, they had to overcome problems that you and I don't think about. We take for granted. There was the language problem. There was the culture. There was and many of these people were very cultured from Europe. When you think of a person like John Hirsch, who was raised in Winnipeg, he was a Congress orphan, and a most talented young man. And we just had many like him. But it took a great deal of work to help the Canadian parent and one of these children adjust. We had to find homes for these children, suitable people, and many people came forward. There was a great emotional upheaval when Jews began to arrive from Europe. People came forward and did a great deal. And so the agency acted as sort of the liaison between the community and the new refugees, in addition to giving all the services.
In what ways was the non-Jewish community involved in the refugee settlement process?
Not too much in Winnipeg at the time. Now, as I said, just when they started to come, I really had to do a lot of legwork looking for shelter for these people and making contacts within the Jewish community. And then at that point, my husband arrived back from overseas. And so I resigned, and he and I went to Weyburn, Saskatchewan. I had a position offered to me by the Saskatchewan government, but I became pregnant with my first son, and so I took time to take care of my family.
Mm-hmm.
But in Weyburn, we had a mental hospital there, and there was a graduate I went to school with, Marg Hanley, and she and I, on a volunteer basis, organized a club for retarded girls that were placed in the community, working in houses as maids. And these girls didn't have anywhere to go during their day off. So we used to make a little party for them and show them how to play cards and give them an opportunity to meet and make friends. And so that was my first piece of volunteer work.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of kept my hand in social work.
Right.
As a matter of fact, we all received diplomas, 2-year diplomas. They did not give master's degrees, but we spent the 2 years at the School of Social Work. And so I had thought, they had told us at the time, that we would be able to do a thesis and we would get a master's degree. So I thought I would do my thesis on the hospital, something on a variety of cases there. But then the university had changed its mind, and they said you had to go back for an additional year to do your thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, no dice.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a lot of people like myself who have practiced and been accepted as the equivalent of masters.
Mm-hmm. Right. Over the next several years, you were with a variety of agencies, and I don't know whether those were paid jobs or volunteer jobs, from 1949 to 1956.
Well, from 49 to 56, I was child rearing. And we moved to Edmonton in August 1949.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as my husband put his professional card in the journal, somehow people knew about me and started calling me from the various organizations. And so I became very involved. The National Council of Jewish Women, the John Howard Society. As a matter of fact, they asked me to work for 1 month until the new director came in. So I got my first touch with prison rehabilitation, and I became very much interested in it. And so they invited me on the board, and I became the first lady chairman of the local board. Then later I became the first woman to be a provincial president of a John Howard Society. And I was very much involved with them from 1950 to 1957. National Council of Jewish Women, they had an interesting development here. The community chest was in operation then, and they gave a committee from Brene Britt, a National Council of Jewish Women, a grant every year to do welfare work in the Jewish community. And I was very upset to find that people would get up and give reports about cases and reveal the names of who was being helped. And so the community chest asked me to get involved and see just how the money was being used and how the people were being helped and so forth. And so I got involved and found myself for 5 years doing casework in the Jewish community as a volunteer.
Was there a Jewish Family Agency then?
No.
Okay.
I got National Council of Jewish Women interested in forming a Jewish agency. We started, it was called the Jewish Welfare Society, around 1952 we incorporated. It was a very interesting development. It was a part-time agency at the same time that we started a Jewish Community Council, and we purchased the services of a chap by the name of Matthew Ram. He's now in Montreal in private practice. Matthew was working for Canadian Jewish Congress, and he was an excellent caseworker, and he got the agency started. Then, and I was the first president of the board, then we started we wanted to bring in a full-time professional in the Jewish community to run all Jewish services. And that person was Max Levy, who is also from Montreal. Max worked for 4 years and then decided to move on. And the board of the Jewish Welfare Society invited me to come back to work and to take over the Jewish Welfare Society part-time. For 1 year, I did the whole job of the community services, where there was fundraising, and there was community org, and there was casework. I did that for a year, and of course that's too much. And as soon as I got in there, and people knew that there was an ongoing service available, it quickly grew into full-time, and more than full-time. I worked for almost 15 years alone and carried the full case load and the administration.
Mhm.
I gave the agency 24 years of service.
Mhm.
We started out with a $2,000 budget, and it grew to over $100,000 by the time the 20 years went by.
A lot of changes during that time, I'm sure.
Yes. Now, there were some interesting things that I was involved in, both professionally and volunteer-wise. In addition to John Howard Society, I was one of the founders of the Mental Health Association. We found this was an important need in the community. The first time I went back to work was to be the local executive secretary of the Canadian Conference on Social Work. My work was to make all the local arrangements and to liaise with the program director at the time, Johnny Farina. I guess you know Johnny.
Yes.
This had a tremendous impact on social work in the Edmonton community because it was the first time there was a social work conference of this magnitude in Western Canada.
About when was it?
1956. Dr. Andrew Stewart, the president of the university, was chairman of the board. And it was a most exciting and interesting year for me. I had to travel. I had to do liaison work with all the board members scattered across Canada. There was all this planning, getting together committees here locally, getting everybody functioning and getting it coordinated. And it was a very rewarding experience for me. And that was what got me out of the kitchen scraping carrots and back into the office doing social work.
To go back for just a minute, you came to Edmonton in 1949.
Right.
In relation to what you just told us about the Canadian Conference on Social Work, what professional social workers were there here in 1949?
There were three of us. There was Margaret Dick, who was the director of the Family Service Bureau. And incidentally, I was on their board, and I rose to vice president before I retired. And Hazeldine Bishop, who was the director of the, what they called the Council of Social Agencies in those days. It has changed names so many times that I don't think I could tell you the name of it now. You know, a rose by any name smells the same. Edmonton was a desert as far as social work was concerned. Charlie Hill was the director of child welfare. The government was completely turned off. They had had the Charlotte Whitten expose just before I came. And social work was a dirty name around this province at that point. But then people started drifting in, like Stuart Bishop came in to be the superintendent of city social services. Mary Morrison Davis, she came in, I don't know the exact date, I think she came in the early 50s. Mary came to work for DVA up to the University Hospital. And so people started drifting in after that. Later there was Isabel Monroe and George McClellan and Keith Wass. And anyway, there were just three of us who sat down one night in my home, and we decided we were going to try and form a branch of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. And we started to look for people who were eligible to be members. And of course, at that time, it was a master's degree or the equivalent. Now it's interesting to see it's developed into, I think they have a membership of about 500 social workers now. And I wasn't too happy at the time that they set up provincial organizations and opened membership to BAs, pretty well anything. At the time, I was rather vocal and very negative to the idea. I felt there should be two organizations like they have in the United States, where they have the National Association, in which they blanket in everybody. And then they have the Association for people with masters and PhDs. Because one of the things that I really worked at on a daily basis was to sell social work as a profession in Edmonton. And it was very difficult.
What did you tell people in those days? What was the benefit of professional training for social work?
Well, I told them that the uniqueness of social work training was that we, of course, kept confidentiality, the ethics of the profession, and that our most viable tool was relationship, working out helping, caring relationships. We were not social workers with the fancy briefcases or the ones that go with tight pants and long haircuts and all this sort of thing. I mean, we're people who were there in what we called a helping profession. And one of the problems that I saw social workers grappling with, and I don't think they've really overcome it, and that was defining themselves as a profession. Doctors knew who they were, dentists knew who they were, lawyers knew who they were. You couldn't get into the professional association if you weren't trained and had proper qualifications. And yet social work kept defining themselves, you know, like a dog chasing its own tail. And they just couldn't seem to find their identity. And it seems to me, of course, those that are coming out of schools of social work now, they come from the me society. And I don't fault them that they get good wages. But one of the things that bothers me is that too many of them are mental health therapists, and not enough of them are close to the people they're helping. The MSWs have become administrators because, after all, this is where the money is. And they're consultants and heaven knows what. Whereas every Tom, Dick, and Harry is hanging out a shingle, and they're counselors. and marriage therapists, and heaven knows what. I think that the worst thing that happened to social work was the day that we called ourselves counselors. You know, anybody can counsel. The milkman can counsel me. But I always felt that the uniqueness of social work was casework. This made the difference.
How do you see casework? What does it involve in your mind?
Well, to begin with, I think it's a one-to-one relationship that develops between two people. I mean, you either make it or you don't. As I've said to students that I have supervised, I used to do that in Winnipeg, School of Social Work. I used to say, never dig so deep that you can't come up clean. And through the relationship, you could build and start helping the person redirect or rechannel their lives. I can take, for example, a widow who suddenly loses her husband and loses income and loses status and loses everything. And her husband had always been the one that was the pusher and the doer in the family. And suddenly a woman finds herself with 3 small children, no income, and a house with a mortgage, and the roof falling in. Now, the job of the social worker was not only to go in and help her with the basic things that she needed to carry on, but she had to help that woman revamp her whole life and pick up her strengths and help her to channel them in the direction that she could survive and raise her family. And I always felt that where parents were incapable of getting ahead or breaking the welfare trap, I always used to feel you worked with the children, providing them with opportunities, strengthening their values, and getting them out in the community so that they could be self-supporting, self-respecting individuals. Mm-hmm. And this is where I always felt the emphasis should be, and this was the way I worked. Because I believe, I always have and I always will, that the family is the most important unit in our society. And the most creative thing a woman can do is to raise a good family and provide a good home for her husband. Mm-hmm. And if she doesn't want to do that, then she shouldn't get married. Mm-hmm. She shouldn't have a family.
And the role of the social worker then is to, in your mind, I suppose, would be to facilitate that development.
Yes. Mm-hmm. To strengthen the family. Mm-hmm. Because personally, I have felt that regardless of the years that I gave to social work, the most satisfying and rewarding thing I've done was to raise a good family. To me, that was the priority. If I couldn't set that example in the community, then I would be a phony. And of course, that would get us into the women's lib and that whole can of worms. But
maybe that would be a good place to stop for a few minutes.
Good.
All right?
Good.
Okay, Mrs. Mintz, when we left off, you were talking about the role of social work. I'm wondering if we can go back for a minute to some of your, some of the jobs that you've had. During the 50s, you worked for the State of Israel Bonds Organization and the Zionist Organization of Canada. What were you doing there?
Well, they were organizational jobs. With State of Israel Bonds, they had a regional director, Dr. Rupert Schreier, and he hired me on a part-time basis to assist him with the campaign. They'd come in every year and put on a campaign, and for a couple of years, it was a part-time position. I was paid an honorarium. And during that time, we developed a women's division to State of Israel Bonds. Now that was the one contribution, I guess I could say, I made at that point. And then I had sort of established in myself a reputation of being good at setting up workshops and conferences and that type of thing. And so the Zionist organization, their regional president, Mr. Wolfie Margolis, hired me to set up a conference for him. They came in from all over Canada, and of course the usual thing, all the arrangements and so forth. Very interesting, very exciting. I used to like to organize, and I think I was good at it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course they would pay me an honorarium. I helped to, well, I did set up a workshop for the Council of Social Agencies. I don't know whether you heard of Bill Nichols. He used to be the director. I did that for Bill. So these were sort of part-time things I did until I took on the directorship of the Jewish Welfare Society in 1958.
Mm-hmm. When you began at the Jewish Welfare Society, as it was then called, I think you mentioned that earlier, could you tell us who your clients were and what some of their needs were?
Well, at that time, in addition to casework, with all the variety of problems, parent-child relationships, marital problems, the elderly, adult children and their aged parents, all of these things, delinquency. There were some rather interesting things happened. For example, the city at that time took care of the delinquents. When they would hit a Jewish child, they used to delegate the authority to Jewish Family Services, well, Jewish Welfare Society, to carry the case and work with the family and the child. And this worked out very successfully. The government, with negotiation with the Child Welfare Department, would give us permission to place a Jewish child in a Jewish home and supervise the child there. Also, we used to work with adoptions. Now, we of course couldn't home find or place the child because that's under the jurisdiction of the Child Welfare Department, but they would call on us to recommend a couple or check with us on a couple. They were doing a community survey, or couples would come in to us and say, well, we want to adopt. And I would work with them, have an interview with them or two, and discuss whys and wherefores of adoption and the things to look for and the concerns that they were to have. And then, of course, you must know that the child welfare department changed the act to cut across religious lines for adoptions. I was very disturbed about that development because the Jewish community did not want to lose their children to be adopted out to non-Jewish homes, because the child is very important in Jewish life. Consequently, I did initiate through our agency a committee from our community to make a presentation to the Child Welfare Commission that was headed by Judge Marjorie Bowker. We didn't win, but what we did get was time. They couldn't adopt out a child before 12 months. They would give the Jewish community 12 months to come up with a good adopted. And if we failed, well then they could adopt the child out. But we were sort of a watchdog. We kept tabs, and also if a Jewish couple were going to adopt a non-Jewish child, there were certain repercussions. And we would be able to direct the parents where to go, what their responsibility was to have the child converted. Because a non-Jewish child, even though adopted by a Jewish couple, has to be converted. And so our agency used to be instrumental in seeing that these things were done. We got in, it was rather interesting. I used to wonder what happened to old people in this community. The other family agencies did not seem to be involved. And we were very concerned in the Jewish community. I mean, the elderly, care of the elderly is an important responsibility. And so through the National Council of Jewish Women, and incidentally, we changed our name to Jewish Family Services 2 years after I became director, because the connotation of welfare in a small Jewish community was a stigma. And also it did not describe the services that we were giving, which were strongly slanted to casework and not to social assistance, because the province was very generous with social assistance in those days.
So it was no longer the case that the agency was distributing funds on behalf of governments?
Well, we never did. I mean, the government, we would intervene. We were the advocates. Advocacy was something that we did from the very day the agency opened. I never could understand why that became a big thing lately. I mean, this is part of a social worker's job, is to use the resources of the community skillfully and to make contact and make sure that your client is getting a fair shake. So then I became concerned about the aged, and Council of Jewish Women and our agency got together, and we did a survey and a study of the needs of the elderly in the Jewish community. And the first thing we came up with was to establish a Jewish senior citizens drop-in center. And one of the founders and the first president was Mrs. Sita Margolis. And Sita and I worked together, and we established a new organization in the community, and Jewish Family Services provided the counseling for the drop-in center. And we've had a very close relationship. Later, Jewish Family Services started a Kosher Meals on Wheels program because elderly Jewish people will not eat non-kosher food as a rule. And so we established that service and worked it through the drop-in center. So there were many ways that we were able to extend our services and provide a broader service in the Jewish community. I used to do a lot of work with B'nai B'rith, who have youth programs. For 2 years, they purchased my services to be executive secretary to Camp B'nai B'rith out in Pine Lake. And that again was administrative work.
Mhm.
Plus I used to be troubleshooter if there were problems with the children at the camp. And of course they would refer any problem children from Edmonton back to our agency.
Mhm.
So that we had a great deal of liaison with the synagogues and with the various organizations in the community.
What, okay. Wait till I turn this over. What is the size of the Jewish community in Edmonton? What number of people are we talking about here?
We have about 5,000 Jewish people, men, women, and children.
Mm-hmm. Just quite a few people for one agency, too. Not that you would deal with all of them, of course.
No. We referred people out for specialized services. In the beginning, I had to be resourceful because we didn't have the services. We had one trained psychiatrist in Edmonton when that agency opened, Dr. Sidney Spanner, who was a unique person. And Sid worked very closely with our agency, and he was my consultant, and he was Mr. Everything to us.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, other psychiatrists came in, and now we have a lot, and a lot of psychologists. But Edmonton was really a desert at the beginning.
Yeah. Over the years, you were the sole staff member of the agency?
Yes. And then in 1970, we brought in a caseworker.
Mm-hmm.
Now there are 3 people on staff.
Mm-hmm. What was it like during the years that you were a one-man show, so to speak? Where did you get your help from and your support, and who did you talk things over with?
Well, I'd look in the mirror every morning and talk to myself. And then I used to have Dr. Spanner. He was my chief consultant. And I also had people that I respected in the field and were like Mary Morrison Davis. And there were other people, Bob Dieldall, who was with the John Howard Society. There were a few. Really what I do would be kick around a case. I used to get a lot of support from the government. There were people in the government that would really do handsprings for our agency. We had, I think, a very good reputation in the total community. And the woman that I brought in is now the director of the agency, Mrs. Florence Schaefer. And she's an outstanding counselor. She's just an outstanding person. In a small agency like Jewish Family Services, it's much more intimate. There's a closeness that you wouldn't find in a large agency where you go through levels of people until you reach the service level. you know, an intake worker, and then you see somebody else and somebody else, you know. In a small agency, they look to you as your Jewish Family Services. This is my place to come when I'm in trouble.
Right.
And so you had opportunities there for flexibility, for doing innovative things. You didn't have to go through layers of people to get a law changed or a bylaw. All you need was your board to make a decision that you would expand your service to take in another group of people that you wanted to service. And so we got into groups. We worked with the family as a group. We set up groups, you know, single women, widows, so on, where they would meet, social workers, run a group on certain topics. We'd have groups for adult children of aged parents to discuss their problems. We ran groups of adolescents, parents of adolescents. And we were able to reach out. It was sort of an outreach program. And you would find that people would surface that were really having serious problems that required individuals, an individual service. And then we had a rather interesting group that ran for a year. It was parents of preschool children. And it was very interesting that the fathers participated so fully in this group. They were so concerned, and there wasn't anybody in that group who had less than one university degree. They were all professionals and degree people and so on, and they seemed to be the last group in the world that you'd think would sit down and spend an evening to talk about their children. And they were very excited about it. But all of these were things that we tried to do. And then we covered the whole expanse. But then there was something that I think you'd find interesting, which was a development that our agency, we did, and that was work with immigrants. Now we had waves of people come in according to the politics in Europe. First of all, we had the Hungarian refugees to be settled and established in the community. And then we had the people who came from Poland. There were about 35,000 Jews left in Poland, many of them intermarried, and some who were one half Jew, one quarter Jew, but they were all thrown out. And so we got a group of them came into the community. We got the people from the DP camps, from the concentration camps, and problems developed with some of their adolescent children. Many of them needed help in getting established in our community. And then finally, in the 70s, the Russians came. Our little agency settled over 500 Russians.
Amazing. In Edmonton.
Yes. 2 social workers at the time. And we settled 500 people.
That's astonishing.
And I can remember going out to the international airport at 1 o'clock in the morning, 30 below zero, to meet a group of Russians who were arriving. And it was quite an emotional feeling at the beginning to see people come to Canada, people that you never expected would ever leave Russia. And they allowed them out. And that was a very big job. Now most of these people were professional people. They were doctors, dentists, engineers, a large number of engineers, very skilled people. And so there was a tremendous job of harnessing the Jewish community resources as well as non-Jewish people to place these people in jobs, to get them into housing, and to get them going, getting them English language. This was a very big problem for them. Because most of these people, only the elderly, spoke Yiddish. They spoke Russian. Few of them spoke more than a smattering of English. And so communication was a big problem. And we had to do casework with people who didn't know what a social worker was. And a psychiatrist meant that you'd be thrown in an institution. Because in Russia, if you're a dissident, they throw you in institutions and in camps and wherever. You lose your job, you lose everything. And so we had this very large group of people who very quickly we got them integrated in the community. But we made use of all our resources, the synagogue, the Hebrew school, and that in itself is a story in the camp. And we used every resource we had. And it's very, very interesting that these people will make, in many cases, a real contribution to Canadian life.
And without your agency there to do the initial reception and sort of distribution, I guess, for lack of a better word, they might not be integrated yet.
They'd be lost to the Jewish community. And this is what we don't want to happen. They left because they were Jews. And therefore it was our responsibility to make sure that they were a part of our community. Now what they do later is their business. They'll be, they're Canadians, but they needed a great deal of help with documentation, resumes, papers. They were frightened of bureaucracy. There were so many day-to-day problems that you and I take for granted. And then they started bringing in their aged parents. And this was a whole new ballgame. So the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society of Canada had to provide funds which we distributed for the care of the old, paying their rent, food, making sure they had medical care and the whole bit.
Well, even for those particular people, the issue of nursing home care or some kind of care as their age increased and their condition declined. With the language problems alone would be quite a challenge, I would think.
Yes. And what we did with these people was that at the drop-in center, we had volunteers who set up English classes for them. And then the government also, at the vocational school, they set up classes for senior citizens. And we used to send them there. So it was very hard for them to learn. They just learn a smattering of English. They're picking it up, but it's very difficult for the elderly.
Sure.
They were the ones that I really felt a great deal of concern for. The parents, the children, we got them right into the public school system. The younger ones we sent to the Hebrew school, but the ones that were too old to go to the Hebrew school went into the public school system. And they picked up the English and they became acclimatized. In fact, they picked up the worst of Canadian kids, if you know what I mean. And they saw a different kind of disciplining in Russia. Parents had a different role to play than the kind of role that parents play in our society. And so this created quite a bit of confusion. But always the children become easily established, and the parents have that difficulty. The culture shock is very great for them.
I'm wondering if we could move toward some general questions as we sort of move toward a conclusion here. It appears to me that you've been a pretty keen observer of the profession over the years, certainly a participant, but also an observer. I'm wondering if you'd have some comments about changes in the profession over the years.
Well, as I realize that change comes. For those of us who started out in the early years, I think it's been, at least I found it a little difficult to see the profession change into a more clinical approach to dealing with people. I've always been concerned about what happens to people in an agency that takes this clinical approach. Maybe they're doing a better, well, I'm sure they're doing a better job individually. I'm sure we have some excellent practitioners. And of course, they've got youth. And what is more beautiful than youth? It should only happen to me, you know. But the thing is that these kids that are coming out of school now are from the Me Society. And many of them that I interviewed and wouldn't consider for positions at Jewish Family Services were because of this aggressive, pushing desire to get ahead. And there wasn't this close identification with the individual. And as I mentioned before, I don't think anyone can go through life without feeling they've been touched by certain people. Be it a teacher, be it a social worker, a group leader, a clergyman, as well as your own family. And this is part of what I feel that the profession is getting away from. We're using up the MSWs, the well-qualified people in the consultant and the organizational and the administrative jobs, because that's where the money is and the prestige. And the people who are at the gut level, who are working with these horrendous problems that we're facing today in our society, we're getting people with BAs, with very little training. True, they're training people on the job, and people are taking courses in social work and so on. The schools are extending themselves. But I'm just not quite sure of what these people are learning in schools of social work. I'm just not quite sure of how deep their commitment lies.
Commitment to what?
To people. To the people they serve. I mean, it's fine to run a well-organized agency and have all kinds of little inter-agency conferences and little workshops and little meetings. But what is happening on the level of the person who's being served? You know, the transient who's stranded in your community, the immigrant who's faltering, the kids who are running away from home, whose parents are practically throwing them out of the house, the marriages that rot before they even last very long. I mean, what is happening to these people? Are the people that are dealing with them qualified like I had hoped to see people qualified? Because that was what I wanted from the very beginning, particularly when I moved to Alberta and saw the level of social work. I always pounded away at professionalism, better training, greater commitment, all of these things, and to get at the root of the problems rather than to take the Band-Aid approach. And so if I sound a bit disillusioned, it's maybe because I'm getting old and people have younger ideas. I know that when I decided to retire, I was burned out. I really, if there is such a thing as burnout, I was it. Because you know, you only have so much to give, and then you can't give anymore.
You've obviously given a lot over the years.
I tried.
What would you measure among your accomplishments?
You want me to tell you what I think is my greatest accomplishment? My children and grandchildren. I have 2 wonderful sons, and the things that they're achieving, I'm getting great joy and satisfaction out of it. My other accomplishment was the service I gave to the Jewish community. I gave a lot to the non-Jewish community. It may not sound as if I did, but I was very much involved with social workers in the community. They always called me on committees and so forth. But I always felt that the Jewish community needed social workers, people who would commit themselves and would want to help their own people. And that we should spearhead services that would be an example to the total community. And if I was able to achieve a little bit of that, then I feel I did a job.
Final question on it, at least for me anyway. I wonder what it has meant to be a social worker for you.
Well, I think it's been great. I'm a people person. I like to be with people. And I don't say that I like all kinds of people. I don't have to like everybody, and they don't have to like me. But I met a lot of people. I touched base with people all over Canada and many in the United States. That's all I know is social work. The level of it maybe isn't as high as others that you will interview, but I feel that the skills I developed, the experience that I had, I feel helped in many ways. I know I see a lot of families around Edmonton with whom I worked for many years and who have done very well. And this is a great source of satisfaction. And this is what I feel should be meaningful to a social worker. And if you've missed that, then I feel that you haven't had much job satisfaction or professional satisfaction, because man doesn't live by bread alone.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'd just like to add that I'm not a women's liber, and I feel that the liberation movement has been very harmful to the family. I don't think it has been harmful to women per se, because I think we were robbed through the years by not being able to get into certain professions and equal pay for equal work and all the rest of that jazz. But I think women went overboard, and I think they failed themselves through the movement.
How did women lose?
Well, I think that they're working so hard to be a man, to get into the man's world, that they've lost out on the pleasure of being a female. And you know, it isn't bad to be a female. You see, you can think like a man and be very feminine at the same time. And that doesn't make you any less of a professional person.
Does that show itself to you in social work settings?
Oh yes, I mean, you can see a lot of mixed up social workers. We always used to joke about it back in the 40s. We used to say if you weren't maladjusted, you couldn't make a good social worker.
I wonder if that's still the case today.
Well, it would be something that you might explore and examine, the makeup of social workers, because we are a motley crew.
Yeah, there's a tremendously wide range of backgrounds and experiences.
Yes.
And points of view.
Yes. And perhaps that's what makes the profession so viable.
Keeps it alive.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for your time this morning. I very much enjoyed the interview, talking with you and learning from you.
Well, I hope you did learn something.
I did indeed. A lot.
Fine.
Thanks.